Capes on the Couch podcast is for entertainment purposes only. Dr. Issues is a psychiatrist, but he is not your psychiatrist and does not have knowledge of your individual situation. For any personal mental health concerns, please consult your own healthcare providers. For medical emergencies, please call 911 or the designated number in your area immediately. Remember that you are not alone and help is out there.
Hello and welcome to Capes on the Couch, where comics get counseling. I'm Anthony Sitko.
And I'm Dr. Issues.
This is issue number 153, Holding Out for a Hero. This is not an hour of Bonnie Tyler singing references. I'm sure there will be one or two, but Matt, as he is wont to do, has given us a theme. And this one is really a doozy. Ever since he sent it to me a couple weeks ago, I've been really mulling over how I want to respond to this, because I think this is a situation where I am going to peel back the neutrality curtain, so to speak, not in a harsh sense, but I speak of my opinions on this show very sparingly with respect to some like real world issues and things. I let things slip from time to time, but I try and keep the focus on mental health, comics, things of that nature. I'll throw out references here and there, certainly. But for something like this, because it's so related to the crux of the issue and the things that Matt is bringing up and the examples that he's bringing up, I'm going to feel obligated morally and intellectually to just provide some counterbalance to some of these notions. Not all of them. Certainly there are areas where Matt and I see eye to eye, but then there's areas where we don't. And so this, I would say more so than any of his other thematic episodes, gives me the opportunity to just kind of speak my mind just a titch on some of these things. And you'll understand what I'm talking about when we get there. So I'm just going to go ahead. Oh, before I go, Doc, you got anything you want to?
Yeah, there's a couple of potential topics. Depending on how long this episode runs, I'll do my best not to bogart it, but definitely there are some opportunities where I may overstep my bounds, and I'll do my best not to, because the whole point of this podcast is my role as a psychiatrist, not my role as a person in the political sphere, a person in the financial sphere. And that's the part where, depending on how far we go with this, I have some significant opinions, but once again, I'm not sure that really is going to be on brand. Not that I'm trying to sound like we are 100% just salesy in what we do, but actually it's more the authenticity of staying to what I think our audience needs to hear, as opposed to what I view the world to be. There is a difference. I like the fact, and Anthony knows this about me, I have no problem with people having different views. And I actually think that's what the world needs. The part that makes me a super weirdo is that if anybody ever wants to show me that they truly are about overall world benefit, have someone from an opposing party in your own system. I dare you. And if you can do that without destroying what you believe in, then I think you actually have something that's truly long lasting and worthwhile to the rest of the universe. And if you're not willing to do that, then you know what? You might still do a lot of good, but it's going to have its limitations. And I will do my best to leave it there, because this is the most enticed I've ever been to really get into some things that might get me in trouble with my mouth.
So I'm sure at this point now, Matt is listening to this going, okay, bring it on, dudes. Because that's who Matt is. He's certainly never one to shy away from an intellectual debate. And it's one of the reasons why we've been friends as long as we have. Seriously, I don't have very many friends left from college, and he is one of a literal handful. So, as is Matt's style, he wrote a lengthy description with numerous examples. So allow me to read his background. Holding out for a hero. Not just the single most overused song on movie soundtracks in the 21st century. You're not wrong there. Also the name of a trope denoting the tendency of individuals, governments, and entire societies who exist in worlds where there are superheroes fighting crimes and averting disasters all over the place to become overly dependent on them, to the point where heroes actually breed a degree of learned helplessness at best and breathtakingly casual recklessness at worst. Do I need to take the time to check that my safety harness is properly fastened before I climb up this building's spire to do maintenance? Nah, if I fall, there's someone out there who will save me. Do we need to spend hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars to install positive train control throughout our rail system? Why? It costs nothing for a superhero to just save everyone whenever there's a derailment. If they're a super strong superhero, they'll even put the train back on the track for us. Should the government seek a diplomatic solution in this international conflict? Are you kidding? Look at all these superheroes we have on our side. We'll do whatever we want and you can take it up with them if you have a problem with it. This is one of my favorite story minds of the superhero ethos. The conflict between helping people and making their lives better versus doing so much for them that they lose the ability or the will to do anything for themselves. Probably because it's extremely relatable here in the real world. Sociological interactions from the individual level of parent-child all the way up to the global level of government-citizen have always involved a need to strike that kind of balance. Guaranteeing people safety, security, and relative prosperity has a tendency to lessen the responsibility people feel for providing it to themselves and one another on an individual level. Superheroes intervening to solve dangerous situations as they're happening can create a type of bystander effect that dissuades anyone else from even trying to help out, especially if it's something that's an everyday occurrence. Man, oh man, does this have a lot of real-world parallels that we'll get into. But first, as always, some comic book examples. Elliot S. Maggin's classic Must There Be a Superman? The Guardians of the Universe let Superman know that one of the tenets of the Green Lantern Corps is to handle the much larger world-threatening crises and to not do everything for sentient races because it can actually stagnate evolution itself. When Superman gets back to Earth, he tests the assumption out by landing in a random small town where the citizens ask for his help with everything, including fixing a leaky roof. During Mark Waid's first run on The Flash, a recurring theme is that part of the reason that the scientific community of Central City is so groundbreaking in its work is that they can push the boundaries of safety in their experiments well beyond what would normally be considered acceptable. They view having the Flash around if anything goes wrong as the only safety measure they actually need. Ultimate Spider-Man Annual number 2. After Peter's 9th or 10th run-in with the Shocker, he is shouting at the top of his lungs in frustration as to how he's still not in jail after all the times he's been caught. Thankfully, Foggy Nelson happens to be nearby because Foggy is the only good attorney in the Nelson and Murdoch law practice. That's just my 2 cents on that. Foggy tells him straight up, dude, you have got to get someone to hang around and give a statement to the police afterwards, or a first-year law student could get any criminal charges dropped. When there's a big crowd of people who just watched a superhero battle, every individual person is going to assume someone else is handling that and go about their day. Number 4, Watchmen. And this is definitely one of the examples I was thinking about when Matt told me about this topic. President Nixon doesn't even try to reach a détente with the Soviet Union or China at the height of the Cold War. America has Dr. Manhattan as the ultimate trump card against anything the communist world could ever do. As a result, they wipe out the North Vietnamese Army in a heartbeat and behave aggressively on the world stage throughout the 70s and 80s. This bites them back in a major way when Manhattan decides he doesn't want to be a part of humanity anymore and leaves Earth. Superman Red Sun. A villain-ish example. Superman creates a utopia in the Soviet Union largely by solving all of the problems that arise himself, but he's cognizant of the fact that he's doing it and tries very hard to get his citizens to start stepping up and following his example. He also could simply take over the world and install communism upon all of humanity by force, but it's critically important to him that humanity make the choice to adopt it themselves, or the ideology won't have triumphed, only he would. Why don't you just put the whole world in a bottle, Superman? Famous line. I love that story. We covered that for a Patreon trade paperback review.
That's right.
It's one of my favorite Superman stories. I love that. So, real world examples. And now is when we're going to kind of take it one by one, because otherwise it's just going to be us just reading Matt's diatribe. Real world examples. You want real world examples? I've got real world examples for you. Seatbelts. Introduced in the 1940s, it took 5 decades for them to become mandatory in all 50 states, and the public fought against them every step of the way. One of the reasons why that we've all just forgotten about, because it's been decades now and people just accept it, Studies done at the time laws were being implemented showed clear evidence that drivers disregarded safety behind the wheel more readily, they drove at unsafe speeds more frequently, and engaged in carelessness and negligence more often, viewing their seatbelt as the ultimate form of protection. As recently as 2001, a National Highway Traffic Safety Administration study conceded the likely possibility that the presence of seatbelts were a contributor to more frequent accidents, even as they decreased fatalities.
Okay, I'm jumping in. So I have no problem with the statement that was just made. Human behavior may indicate that when you think that there's a safety valve already in place, you may act in a way that is more dangerous than if you didn't think there were a safety in place. This has been shown in children when they are placed, for example, on it's an optical illusion, but basically they're placed on a edge, like a ledge of a table, and they think because there's a mirrored glass there that the table has ended. If they don't have the permanency yet, they'll walk right out, nothing happens. But if they recognize, oh, this looks like I'm going to fall off, they hesitate. However, if you actually give them a harness, if you have them suspended, they won't think about that one bit. They'll just jump around as if nothing is ever going to happen and nothing's ever going to go wrong. And that correlates with what he had said with his flash example. There's one major point, though, that is made there that is so critical to this. There's a difference between saying that there may be something that goes wrong and impending death. And the idea that you have an opportunity to show statistically, meaningfully, consistently that you can reduce the number of deaths that happens, actually reducing mortality, that's one of the best things you can do from a policy standpoint. All the other things are incredibly important, and I don't negate them at all. But there's a reason why those go into play. There is a reason why, for example, something that I deal with all the time, patients complaining to me, I'm going to veer off just a little bit, with DUIs. They point out, I only had 1 or 2 drinks. We've had the evidence that there's been cognitive impairment with just 1 drink for a long, long time, well before there are any laws against driving while you've been intoxicated. We've expanded that to include other substances, even if a person doesn't receive a urine test as opposed to a breathalyzer. There's a reason why those things came into play, and thankfully it was due to evidence base. It's the same reason why we're cracking down on texting while driving. It has nothing to do with the idea that you're trying to withhold someone's liberties because they're going to be more free to do things, if you really want to go that far, about how they're handling situations. It's because the value of life itself still holds a strong, strong value. And I'd rather have somebody really pissed off at me that they're going to get ticketed for a seatbelt infraction, in other words, not wearing one, rather than scraping them off the side of the road because, well, what do you know? They decided not to wear it this one time, as opposed to the number of people that unfortunately don't follow regulations as well and get pulled over for speeding tickets because there's still regulation about that, even if they speed more because they're wearing their seatbelt. All right, diatribe off. To relate it to the comic, yes, Flash has a huge influence, and Flash has even been shown at times to literally be on an infinite loop of always being in his hyperspeed mode, constantly surveilling things and trying to fix things over time, and how it impacted his family because that's all he ever did. I forgot, I definitely read a story like that a long time ago, but I think it's the same premise. You can get to the point that if you think you can run things that way, you certainly could try. No one human being can do that. A government agency may be able to do that. A corporation may be able to try that. But ultimately, it's still going to come down to the individual actors. And so I understand the idea that agencies may overstep their bounds in terms of how they're trying to apply that policy to others. But that doesn't mean that it gives the agency complete carte blanche to do whatever it wants, because you're still going to have people making those individual decisions. And I'm not exactly sure we're ever going to get to the point, whether it's a traffic stop, whether it's people responding to an emergency or any of the other things. I know we'll get into that later. I'm not sure we're ever going to get to the point where we can say, well, it's because of that agency's fault and how they put in a policy that other people are acting in a way that's irresponsible. And we're ever going to say, well, you know what? Never mind. We'll ignore it, or we're going to just blame it all on that particular one agency for how they decided that they're going to run things. Last time I checked, anytime there's been a court hearing or ruling on things like this, it still comes down to that one judge that plaintiff, that defendant, or that prosecutor and that defendant and the jury that's involved if it's a jury case, or the judge if it's a bench trial. Either way, you're still dealing with individual human beings that are going to have their own biases, motivations, and emotional factors that are going to cloud whatever we consider to be the facts.
I was just going to say that as someone whose day job is literally working in transportation, that the number of safety features and factors that are taken into consideration when I'm dealing with engineers working on projects. I myself am not an engineer, but I've been at the department long enough to kind of absorb some of this information, at least on a macro level. I'm certainly not going to go out and create these projects myself, but enough on a macro level to be able to say, okay, these are safety factors that need to be taken into consideration. And when we're presenting these projects to local officials, to have mayors, engineers, administrators, traffic control officers saying, oh, you don't need that because we know this area and we know that's not really an issue. I'm sorry, what? We can't eliminate our liability and our responsibility just because you say, oh, that's not really necessary. You don't need that. Because heaven forbid somebody disregards that and speeds, is not wearing a seatbelt, whatever, and you have to scrape them off the sidewalk. You have to use the jaws of life to pry them out because they're pinned against the guide rail, or they ran into the end treatment. And now what was at one point the end of a guide rail is now, 3 feet into their back seat. And they go, well, you should have done something about this. I'm sorry. What? So let's talk about COVID. I mean, as of when we're recording this, the federal mask mandate was just lifted. And what you ended up seeing was mid-flight pilots announcing the mask mandate has been lifted and people taking the masks off with no regard whatsoever for the safety of everybody around them. Now you've got immunocompromised folks on that flight that when they took off anticipated, okay, we're all going to be safe. We're all going to follow these rules that have been established. Halfway through the flight, now folks are taking it off. The vitriol and the anger that has been dictated and espoused towards these, what I were led to believe, common sense safety measures is unreal. And I think part of it is because they have been portrayed in the media and through political spin as restrictions and limitations on people rather than common sense safety measures by people that have limited or no understanding of science. It is incredibly frustrating that the judge that struck down the federal mandate said, oh, masks only stop the virus droplets. They don't actually stop the spread of the virus itself. What do you think is the transmission medium for the virus? Dipshit. It's the droplets. I don't claim to be a virologist. I don't claim to be a scientist. My degree is in communication studies. So I'm as far removed from a science degree as possible, but it's common goddamn sense. The point that I'm getting to, and because I'm trying to keep this somewhat on the rails, pun intended, is that it's very evident that we have a not small portion of society that thinks that freedom to act equals freedom from consequences of those actions. I'm not going to get into the cancel culture discussion and why that's all a crock of horse manure, but freedom to act does not equate freedom from consequences.
And also just one last thing, and I'll move on. Matt does make an excellent point with this, though, because there is something that actually has shown to be a potential detriment despite the attempts at safety, and that is the variation of car seats at an incredibly early age, especially the ones that say that they have the rigidity within the head and neck area where that may actually have backfired depending on not only the orientation of the seat, but also whether or not it is in the front seat or back seat. There definitely is still some room where we may have just gotten that totally wrong. So I also want to acknowledge that there are times where policy gets put in place because it sounds common sense, but later on we get more direct evidence based on events that happen and say, unfortunately, because of those negative consequences, whoops, yeah, which doesn't help anybody for what's happened prior to that. So as intense as myself or Anthony may sound when we describe these things, I really am, and I'm not saying this with ego. I'm saying this with I'd like to think decent confidence. I always try and look at both sides of a certain discussion. And even if I come down on one side or another, I certainly will point out flaws. And that's, oh my God, I'm going back like to our third episode. Rather than straw manning, where you take a side of an argument and you try and just create a false foe that you can easily knock over, steel man it. Take your own argument, put it against something that you think is actually infallible, and still find a way to make your point valid. So that's what I'm doing with my point. Yes, there are certain examples of safety measures that are taken that actually don't have a benefit or may have a detriment. That doesn't necessarily mean that you avoid the policy that may still ultimately, because of the other parts of it, have an overall benefit to society. That's the point I was getting at.
Yes. And I mean, we can go on a lengthy side tangent about the discussion even around masks and the impact of mental health and the role that the last 2 years plus of being masked has had on individuals, on children in schools. There are a litany of valid concerns and questions that can be had about that. It's about the balance. But unfortunately, because, again, not to get off on a separate tangent, we live in a society that doesn't reward nuanced, rational discussions, that focuses on binary for clickbait and things of that nature. Ironically, of course, as the discussion around trans and non-binary individuals is growing, but everything likes to be, thrown into a binary. You're either this side or that side, which kind of, goes into what Matt's next point is. In economics and political science, as you know, we call this the moral hazard. Safety rails in public policy meant to provide government help to people and institutions in hard times can increase the likelihood that they will engage in behavior more likely to bring about said hard times as the fear of the consequences is taken out of the equation. Nowhere is this more prevalent today than in the world's financial industry. It has just become accepted now as a matter of course that the world's governments will always step in with currency support, quantitative easing, and outright bailouts when there is an economic downturn, allowing the large investors of the world to socialize the risks of their operations among the entire population, whether they're a customer who's opted in to do so or not. Because of the interconnectedness of the global financial markets, the costs to the world's economies of a full-scale collapse of large banks and investment houses is seen as much higher than the occasional large payment it takes to keep them afloat. Now, here's where I'm going to chime in, because that argument, as it relates to individuals, I'm not going to necessarily talk so much about the large-scale government bailouts and things of that nature. We can have a separate discussion about that. But the discussion around individuals with respect to either universal basic income or welfare or food stamps or government assistance of any kind, and the notion that, if you give people money, they're just going to blow it on drugs, pornography, whatever it is that society deems as morally unclean, in quotation marks, is used as justification to deny large swaths of the population for that kind of funding. When studies, numerous empirical, fact-based studies have shown that if you provide that funding directly to people, as we saw over the course of COVID with the direct financial payments, as well as the child tax credit advances, that money goes directly back into the economy to pay bills, to provide direct assistance to the individuals that are in most desperate need of those funds. If you give people the welfare, whatever terminology, however it is you want to call it, the EBTs, whatever, the welfare, they're not blowing it on drugs and booze and prostitutes and whatever else that's going to make your puritanical selves clutch your pearls. It's to help people in need. And unfortunately, it comes from this, again, patriarchal, puritanical, and white privilege. And there's racism, there's misogyny, there's a whole host of, there's ableism, there's a whole host of issues that are associated with this, that if we're providing the assistance to people, then by golly, they may start to think that they're equal to us, and we can't have that. So we need to keep them down through whatever means necessary. And it's always under the guise of, but we're going to help protect you. We don't want you to waste it on booze. It's a bullshit argument, always has been, always will be. So the empirical studies have indicated with the child tax credit, how many children were lifted out of poverty because of those child tax credit advances. And then Joe Manchin and his buddies take the fall. By the way, not that I'm defending Joe Manchin, but let's keep in mind also there are a whole host of Republican senators that also voted against that. I know Manchin obviously takes a lot of deserved flack, and Sinema as well. Let's not forget Kirsten Sinema. They take a lot of deserved flack for that stuff, but it's just as much any members of the GOP that are so-called Christians could have opted in to assist whosoever helps, the lowest in need. You have also helped me. I thought these people read the book. Why is it my agnostic ass is the one that's quoting it back to them? I'm kind of all over the place here, but my point is, with respect to the moral hazard, I would venture a guess that studies have shown on the individual level that payments, direct payments, universal basic income, welfare, and things of that nature are incredibly efficient at saving lives and, in the long run, saving money.
Okay.
On a societal level.
All right. So I'm actually going to jump in at the macroeconomic level. But before I do that, I want to give our audience an opportunity. Do not just listen to Anthony, myself, or Matt on these topics. I'm actually going to make some recommendations, which I usually don't do. Okay. If you want a fairly conservative financial view on these topics that I think is well reasoned in terms of both from a religious standpoint, in terms of conservatism, if you want to go that route, but also from a very libertarian financial standpoint, including the alternatives to the current system, DeFi, the future of cryptocurrencies, blockchain technology, et cetera, et cetera. Radical Personal Finance with Joshua Sheets. Okay, that's a pretty good one. If you want a more liberal view, but still very well reasoned because this person actually was in the financial industry, the podcast I'm going to recommend is Money for the Rest of Us with David Stein. And he has a book with the same name, Money for the Rest of Us. It's a great book about how to think about investing. And they've actually been on each other's show and had debates about these types of topics. That's why I'm recommending both of them. And I think they're both amazing at what they do. And if you want a much more generalized view of all of this from an intellectual level, Freakonomics, just about any freaking topic that they do, it's a book, but the podcast extends way beyond that. You'll learn a lot about these types of issues. I'll just lead with that, okay, if you really want to expand your knowledge. Now, for my actual views on this as well, I love the fact that Matt pointed out that currency support, quantitative easing, and bailouts, okay, the whole too big to fail thing when we had, the whole Lehman Brothers collapse in 2008. The reason why the Fed decided to do that wasn't because they figured, well, let's keep the interest rates as low as they can be so that the debt will be cheaper and we'll be able to make the payments. That was a huge part of it. I'm not denying that. I'm saying that was not the driving factor. The driving factor was there was no intervention that was large enough during the Great Depression to stop it from becoming a depression in the first place. The reason why we call it the Great Recession is because despite all the pain that happened, we didn't end up with a panic level, which we used to get in the 1800s whenever there was a financial collapse. There was a reason it was called a panic. It was literally the idea that if enough people were concerned about the financial status of the country, that you could literally just make a run and shut it down. We are no longer at that point, and that's a good thing because you do not want a situation where your own citizenry don't know if they can use their dollar bills to actually buy products. That is not inflation. Inflation is the idea that the price of things is going to go up and therefore your dollar is worth less than what it was before. That has been true forever. There is no financial system where that doesn't happen. If you have that type of closed financial system, the only way that you're able to keep that going indefinitely is pure bartering. In which case, you're implying that every citizen has the ability to trade one thing of value to another citizen, and it'll never end. That's not true. As long as you have children, as long as you have those who are disabled, including especially in the mental health space, because let's be real about this. There was significant deregulation of that when we got rid of asylums, which I think was the right thing to do. I don't think people should be locked away forever. I think that's a huge travesty. Don't get me wrong. Psychiatry has a horrible history with this. But still, the idea that you had people that did not have the resources necessary to survive in the world, and yet the idea was for the sake of their own humanity, simply release them without said resources, that's one of the greatest travesties that we've ever committed. So to bring that relevantly to what we're talking about right now, where you mentioned the whole financial thing, I think the important thing is it's better for people to be complaining, grumbling, and doing all those things about how we're having spikes of inconvenience rather than total destruction, which has been much closer in the past. So I think that's a fair trade-off. And to, once again, I feel like it's necessary to relate it to comic books. And in this case, I don't even have to stretch. Superman, Peace on Earth. He tries to eliminate world hunger. He actually did the numbers himself. He focused on grain because it's the simplest product that you could do that could feed the most amount of people. And you could do it economically. You could do it cheaply. And yet, because of a lot of the political factions that were involved, a lot of the grain was destroyed. People that, and I know how it was drawn because that was the way it was supposed to evoke it, similar to how welfare queens are used as examples of how the system is misused, of children grasping at Superman as he's standing there. And the point that he has a look on his face that he's so overwhelmed that he spins around, digs a tunnel so that he can get to another part of the earth so that he wouldn't have to deal with looking at all those faces at that time because he knew he couldn't just do it all at once in that moment. Or when they have people lined up and they're ready to shoot them because it's a dictatorship, with the point that just because you have a view of how the world runs, until other people have that view, you're always going to be in conflict. And he's able to protect the people, but instead they shoot the grain. Because the whole point is if we can't have it, no one can, which still is a very valid point as to how people view the world sometimes. So the idea that we are able to create a system that economically is able to do so much and so much good for people, including the capitalism involved, but recognizing that there's a limit to exactly how that system can run without senses of corruption, without senses of theft, without the idea that there is a basic underlying moral value to the fact that regardless of what we put monetarily, that there is the essence of human life that still has to be put at the forefront. All of that comes into play when these policies are pretty much mandated. And the idea that just because you want to have something that isn't controlled by a central agency or government, it's a wonderful idea until it isn't. And what I mean by that is, if you have that in place, let's say anonymous or pseudo-anonymous transactions via Bitcoin or whatever cryptocurrency that is has no one to back it, heaven forbid that person was coerced to do that at gunpoint, and now you can't report it to anyone. There is no SEC. There is no FTC. There's no one that's going to be able to reverse a 36-letter key that you just used to make a transaction that was fraudulent with someone else because they happen to think your money was so much more important for their well-being than for yours. So no, I'm not saying that all agencies are working in the best interests of people when it comes to the economics of it. But I am saying I'd rather have a person doing it than a blank algorithm that no one can actually look at or do anything, because once it's done, it's done.
If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and the next place oblige it to control itself. No less a source than James Madison. And I think that goes to your point that some of this comes down to just human nature. I was having a discussion with my family recently about the spikes in gas prices, cost of oil per barrel, and where the money is going. And my brother-in-law said, unfortunately, there's no limit to human greed. And my response was, They found one in France in 1789. It was attached to a guillotine, but they did find one. I'm just saying. So Matt's last point, on a micro individual level, there's the bystander effect and the diffusion of responsibility, the tendency of individuals being less likely to offer help to someone in need when there are a large group of people present, figuring someone else will handle it. The Kitty Genovese case that first brought these terms to the lexicon in the 60s has largely been discredited, but for my money, you need look no further than any instance where there's someone in some kind of dangerous situation anywhere in a public place. What is the first thing almost anyone does? Do they step in and help? Call 911? Scream for someone else to call 911? No, they take out their freaking cell phones and start recording it to post on the internet, as if the 300th camera angle is going to document what's going on in a way the other 299 won't. It drives me freaking nuts. And to that I say, World Star! But
yes. Okay, so wait, I'm going to jump in right there because thankfully there's enough time and space with this where screw it, fully well people are going to try anyway. But the point is, had a case where World Star was definitely involved in terms of verifying what the report was. So the whole Pixar didn't happen thing, yeah, that is a thing when it comes to, serious mental health events. Okay, I'm just going to point that out. So the thing is, what I'm trying to say though with that is that there is some validity to the idea that you do want evidence of things that happen that are for better or for worse. And actually that goes back to the whole Spider-Man reference of making sure you have witnesses to something. That actually gives credence to it. Now, does everyone need to do that at the same time? No, of course not. But also I'm not so sure that we have as many situations of people not calling for help as opposed to broadcasting for the sake of broadcasting or streaming. I challenge that. I have not looked into that recently, so I can't tell you what the numbers are, and I'm not going to speculate. I like I said, I'm challenging. I'm not even saying that Matt is incorrect in this. I honestly don't know. I get the sentiment of it. I certainly get the sentiment of it, but I could even give a personal example, which once again, the weakest kind of evidence you can give is anecdotal, and yet here's my anecdote. I was driving to work one day and a person on a motorcycle just totally sped by me. I mean, I didn't even see them. I heard them, like in terms of how fast they were going. And all I kept thinking to myself is this is going to end in absolute disaster. And I hoped I was wrong. And maybe a mile down the road, I saw the first piece on the road. And I said, oh, well, I guess I know where this is going. And sure enough, here's where I'm going with this. So I pull over. I'm one of 11 cars pulled over. None of us had our phones out, at least not for that reason. Someone had already called 911. I stopped because I'm a doctor and I figured even if I'm a psychiatrist, if there's something I could do to help this person, I certainly will try. So had several nurses. So had another doctor. So had other people who aren't even trained, but simply wanted to make sure that the person didn't move because it was clear that they were in serious trouble. And we waited until the ambulance got there. And my role was simply pointing out to the unfortunate, maybe just because of my morbid nature or whatever, the point that I had not seen half of his body move, as opposed to the person that was taking his pulse, as opposed to the other people that were holding his helmet on his head, which was still on his head, but making sure that he didn't move his neck, as opposed to the people that were talking to him to calm him down because all he kept saying is, I need to get out of here. I need to go, or I have to get up, and pointing out, no, you don't move, sir. All those things to say that, once again, it's an anecdote. And I apologize if it's the only incidence where it's actually happened in a positive way. But like I said, I just want to challenge it. I don't know what the numbers are. I'd love to see what the numbers are. Someone in public health and safety, please, if you're listening to this, I'm sure they'd have more feedback about this. But if it does happen where someone's in a situation where everybody is just simply onlooking and not intervening, I think there have been plenty of examples, though, where it's been shown that the people that intervene often are the ones that also put themselves at risk. And many people aren't willing to put themselves at risk unless it's a good Samaritan situation, which is also why, in the description I just gave, why someone would be willing to act. That's where the examples of superheroes really do come in. The idea that a situation is so dangerous or so egregious that any action that a non-professional citizen is willing to make an effort to improve the situation is not going to come under litigation or further scrutiny. That's something that is really powerful when it comes to, people feeling like they could do something. If there is no evidence that that type of situation exists and you don't know, then yes, you are going to get people just looking. Because the whole point is, if heaven forbid, I'm going to use a horrible example. If it's the Naked Gun and Frank Drebin ends up shooting someone because he sees two guys in a toga, stabbing someone in the middle of a park, he thinks he's doing his job. Meanwhile, his commissioner is saying, that was a reenactment of Julius Caesar, you moron. You killed two actors, good ones. And that's actually a direct quote from the movie. The point being, though, if you don't know what's going on and you think you're going to act wrong, then yes, you are going to be paralyzed by the situation. Not to mention the paralysis that happens sometimes when there's a serious event. It's the reason why, for whatever reason, I know we call it fight or flight. There's the third part. It's fight, flight, or freeze. And some people really do freeze. And I understand that the idea, if you could take out a video, then you can call 911. Yes, of course. But if you aren't thinking that way, and if you're not conditioned to think that way, then you're going to make a different decision. And right or wrong, I understand it. I really wish that I could say everyone acts with the best of intentions, and I know a lot of people don't. I think that's a horrible thing. I think Matt is absolutely right about that part. Absolutely correct. But that doesn't mean it's the majority. That's what I wanted to say.
Fair enough. And I think we've seen numerous cases, as you had indicated, over the last couple of years where cell phone videos do help. Whether it's George Floyd, whether it's, not that George Floyd helped, that the cell phone video helped, but just the idea that we were able to identify those officers, we were able to hold people accountable for these kinds of things. We're able to uncover corruption. We're able to uncover these horrible things. Yes, there are cases where people are more concerned about clout and live streaming and getting likes, views, retweets, what have you. But there is a public good to that. I would also indicate that with respect to something like the Kitty Genovese case, again, largely discredited, but the notion of you don't say, someone call 911. You point to someone and say, you call 911. You get help. That kind of direct order is way more likely to engender a positive response and an appropriate response than this vague notion of someone do it. Because to some extent, it is human nature that we're going to say it could be anybody. And there are a whole host of reasons why people may not necessarily feel comfortable or available to provide that kind of assistance. But the point still stands that, yes, the bystander effect and diffusion of responsibility are real, but that's something that we need to address culturally. And I would also venture to say that's much more prevalent in America than elsewhere in the world. Not to say that other parts of the world don't also have these problems, but for lack of a better term, cultural selfishness that exists in the US is much more baked into who we are culturally and how we identify this notion of individualism and things of that nature, that it comes out in those kinds of ways here in America versus over in Europe or in Asia or in Africa, where culturally the community is much more focused on. In those areas, I would hazard to say that similar situation, there's a public incident, that the community will be more likely to rally around the individual and take the appropriate actions of care and responsibility versus this individualistic, Americanized mindset. And again, I'm not trying to be all Americans are bad, because there are some wonderful positives that have come out of the notions of American individualism, but it is not without its flaws. And if we're going to call things out appropriately on this show, as we often do, let's call it for what it is. We can be very selfish and very self-centered. And so when those people are taking out their cell phones, I'm sure if you ask those individuals one-on-one, they would consider themselves to be helpful, generous, kind, supportive, caring, all those positive attributes 9 times out of 10. But in the mob mentality, it's a psychological thing. I'm sure Doc has done numerous studies on this, that if it's the mob mentality, that has nothing to do with the holding out for a hero. That has nothing to do with the superhero nature of it, or to Matt's point, on the bystander. That is a psychological thing that we as creatures, as animals, have evolved to follow the pack mentality. That is something that, better or worse, still remains in our evolutionary design, something we can hope and aspire to overcome. But I don't foresee that happening anytime soon, if I'm being perfectly frank.
Well, let's look at, these examples given and the medium that we're talking about. If we're talking about comics and we're talking about superheroes, what are we looking at? We're usually not looking at situations where you have a villain who is coming up with a plan and then a superhero that is looking to find the positive light of what that plan is and helping the villain implement it in a way that's going to do less damage. We're talking about a fight. And it's the nature and why we read these things to say, well, let's see how this plays out. We want to know the story. We want to know the outcome. And there is a part of us. I've said numerous times that I'm a fan of MMA and boxing and all those things. Why am I? That's barbaric. It's because it's the idea of one human will against another and how that interaction is going to occur with one person eventually finding a victory out of it. Usually, it doesn't usually end up in a draw. Well, if you take that out to its most extreme format, if you have a horrible scene, whatever it is, in public, because that's usually what we're talking about here. What we're talking about right now is not a private situation where it's significant traumatic events with people who clearly are victimized by a person or group of people that are going to create more problems for them, and nobody else is aware of intervening because of either secrecy, privacy, or just outright, fear of reprisal if they ever do say something to protect themselves. If something is done in public, why on earth wouldn't anybody have a reason to act on it then? Let's be real about that. That's the one time you should always act, in theory. And the answer is because we want to see the result. We actually want to see what happens. That's a very perverse thing to say. And yet, why would there be multiple people that are attracted to these things? There's a reason why we colloquially call things a dumpster fire, a train wreck. People are on a collision course. All these metaphors, all these things that we say is because it's naturally attractive to us because we want to see the resolution of a major event. It's not that the event itself is bad. It's just that we know that it's significant in some way. And if we are there for it along with other people, we are therefore associated with the significance. If you put it in a positive light, there's a reason why people sometimes that you haven't seen in a long time will go to a wedding or a funeral or a graduation or any other major event. It's because that sense of community can be created in an instant based on some very finite moments. And it's hard to organically create that any other way. It's a shame that it comes from tragedy sometimes, and more often than we would like.
Where were you when the towers fell? I mean, for our generation, that's a very, where were you when 9/11 happened? That kind of thing. Where were you when Kennedy was shot? Where were you when the Berlin Wall fell? Where were you when this happened, that happened? We speak of these events. These are tragedy, not the Berlin Wall falling, but you get my point, that these are major historical events and we talk about them. Where were you? That yes, this happened, but let's tie it to the individual. Oh, I was here, I was there. And you get this sense of unity. You get this sense of understanding and comparison of perspectives, because obviously when these types of things happened, we were all in very different places. We were different ages. We were different locations, geographically, etc. So it's this comparison of perspectives, but we never seem to do that to issues. We never seem to do that to the things that ultimately have a massive impact on our day-to-day life. We do that for events. We don't do that for politics. We talk about, oh, where were you here? And you talk and you tell your stories. But when it comes to politics, it's I'm here, I'm over here. Okay, well, either like we're together or you can off. We don't take the time. And I mean, again, I can go off on a whole separate tangent on that. That's largely because my Adderall is wearing off at this stage. It's getting late. So my ADHD is really starting to kick in. But so Matt's final question, which we've kind of like talked around, but his final question is, so as a superhero, how do you use that light touch and do for people what they can't do for themselves without taking away their ability to do anything for themselves? Yes, it is a balance. And it's one of the things that I know it was discussed in the Eternals film for all of whatever that film was trying to accomplish. The notion that Brian Tyree Henry's character was creating the technology and things of that nature. And he said, well, I can't create anything too advanced for them yet because they're not ready for it. And they would misuse that. And then when he blames himself for what happened at Hiroshima, you know, that he's beating himself up because they weren't ready for this and things of that nature. So from the superhero perspective, that is very much a trope that gets discussed a lot. And to bring it to the real world, and again, the discussion we were talking about binaries, this notion that liberals and progressives claim that conservatives want no government and they want everybody to do whatever it is that they want with no oversight whatsoever. Conservatives tend to paint progressives as saying big brother government is watching everything that you do and is in control of your entire life. And that's what the Democrats want. That's what progressives want, et cetera, et cetera. And neither of those extremes are true for the overwhelming majority of individuals. Yes, there are extremists on both sides. But I would venture to say that the balance needs to be discussed in a rational manner. But unfortunately, that never ends up the case. But I would posit that if you speak to individuals, they would tend to err on the side of the safety nets, the guide rails, the structures in place to preserve and help folks and uplift us much more readily than, well, leave them to their own devices and they'll sink or swim of their own accord.
So there's a very simple technique to do this, and it doesn't have to be in the political realm or anything. It could be any topic. I swear to you, it really is this simple. Take the other side that you as a human being disagree with and make their argument for them. Just do it. The goal is not to change your mind about the topic. Your goal is to do it in a way that's genuine to what a human being that actually has positive goals in their life would want if they're taking that side. Because the second that you do that, the second that you humanize someone that disagrees with you, people feel it. I'm telling you, I've seen it happen where the empathy just shoots off the charts in terms of how they appreciate what another person has gone through or how they're processing information. And once you do that, then those individual conversations actually can happen. That's the thing. They're not going to happen because people just don't like doing it. People don't like that discomfort. People don't like the discomfort of something different, of change, of
cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, it's very obvious. And if we're talking about the superhero realm with that, I mean, you could look at any of the conflicts that happen. You could look at Civil War. You could look at JLA and Avengers. You could look at Avengers and X-Men. I mean, these things are just organic to who we are. If you get a large enough group of human beings, you're going to end up with splits. And the fact that, as much as I loathe to admit it, the fact that it usually is a split in two is for the sake of convenience, because you can't usually have a nice, even battle with 3 or 4 or 5 different sides. That only works in board games. But really, I'll admit, I have some radical thoughts myself. I'm not going to get into that. Anthony knows how I feel about certain political topics. But my point, to bring it back to just the psychology and psychiatry of it all and all that. Well, I'm not even going to say psychiatry, because psychiatry is different. But yeah, the mental aspect of all of this is, no human being is that far away from another human being that they wouldn't be able to appreciate their circumstance if they actually just took the other side for a few minutes. Nobody. I don't care who you are. Really. I mean that. I believe that in my core. And I recognize that a lot of people listening to this are really upset right now. And that's not the intention. At least not the intention in the way you're thinking about it. My intention with that is, if you're angry about it, are you angry because you're scared to try it? Or are you angry because you hadn't considered it before, and it's been a while in your life before you even gave it the opportunity? So you're going to do it now. Either way, I'm actually happy with that. I can rest easy knowing that we've discussed this in a way that I think is a potential for growth, a potential to show that, in theory, Anthony and I could probably just go ahead and do our political talk show and make some decent money before we get canceled in like a year and a half or something for saying the wrong thing at the wrong time at some point, which would definitely, it's a guarantee to happen.
I'm just impressed you think we'd last a year and a half.
Hey, man. No, you don't understand. I'm saying we could hop, like, you know what I mean? Because that's pretty much what happened with a lot of these people. They just go from one station to another until they run out. But whatever. I mean, Sirius has a lot of clout though, so who knows?
Anyway, this was such an interesting topic for me, because we're going to start winding down. Obviously, with these kinds of episodes, they tend to go on just a little bit longer, or they can go on a little bit longer because, ironically, there are fewer guide rails, so to speak, for the conversation. And so when we're talking about characters, we tend to be very focused on the issues and the treatment and things of that nature. These episodes are much more free flowing and open ended. But it was a situation where I just wanted to make it clear that I respect Matt, and he and I have had numerous conversations about this over the past 20 years. And holy shit, dude, that's how long it's been since we've been having these conversations. But the idea that we can respectfully disagree on certain things, but not have it turn into vitriol, or I'm gonna cancel being friends with Matt, or he's going to cancel his Patreon subscription because of the disagreements that we have about this. Like, no, that's not who either of us are. And I'm hoping that, based on this discussion that we're having, that our listeners can take something away from this and apply these lessons to their own life, to the conversations that they're having with the people in their lives that they may be disagreeing with, and just come to some level of understanding and appreciation.
Yeah, if you want to expand this even more, because I know I already gave the idea in general, but I think we can even make it even more palatable for people. And I had this idea after the couple of Avengers movies that featured Thanos. With the snap, I had this thought, because people were so traumatized by their favorite characters potentially going away or whatever. What would have impressed me would have been if they actually used a random number generator and they used that for the MCU, and they cut it in half and literally just said, okay, these are the ones that are gone. Now we have to make the story with the ones that are left. Because that's really what the snap should have represented, rather than the story that we got, which was amazing. I loved it. But I'm saying I feel like that would have been an opportunity for true chaos theory, outside the box thinking. Why am I saying that out loud now? What I'm saying is, I've already given examples when I mentioned Civil War and things like that, where you could understand ideologically why characters were facing off against one another, even if they were considered quote unquote heroes. Okay. My point is almost like a card game. If you could take major characters that usually work as a team or are known to be a team with other characters that are known as villains or opposing and all that, if you mixed them up, shuffle the deck, you take 4 or 5 of them and you say, what is the common theme that these characters would have? I'm not talking, oh, well, they all wear masks. I'm not saying that, not that superficial. I'm saying from a personality, from a philosophy, from an action standpoint, what do these characters have in common? And if you're able to do that with some really eclectic bunches, then that's how you can tell your brain is really processing what the worlds can be. If you're able to truly do that, and it doesn't just have to be comic books or superheroes or whatever. It could be any form of fiction. And it's better to do it with fiction than with reality because we already try and do it with reality. We already try and pigeonhole each other. Don't do it with them. Do it with the ones that you love. Do it with the ones that you already feel like you know inside and out, and try and just mix the bag a little bit and see what you come up with. It expands your mind, it expands your empathy, and it allows you to live a better existence with people that aren't going to see eye to eye with you on everything.
This episode was supposed to talk about the notion that governments or superheroes or larger than individual actors can suppress the desire for people to help themselves. And it morphed into, let's have better discussions with people who disagree with us.
No. That's not far off. I'll tell you why. It's because of the illusion of the larger entity. The entity exists, okay? Government exists. Large organizations exist. Corporations exist. The same way families exist. The same way communities exist. But here's the thing, and I'll really end on this one, and I'm going to butcher this once again like I butcher everything. But the point is, it's fascinating. I never did anything because I thought that there was no chance that I could ever change the world. But I realized if I interacted with one person, then that one person would interact with their family. And if I interacted with that family, that means I interact with their community. If I interact with that community, that means I interact with their state. If I interact with their state, then at some point I interact with the country. If I interact with the country, it means I interact with the world. And if any one of those positions at any one of those points changes, then that means that I really did change the world. Don't ever think that there is one thing that's too big for one person, because that's how you let those larger organizations control you.
Beautifully said. Was that a quote from something or?
I know I've heard it from somewhere, but that's my point. I can't even remember where or when, but I loved it so much that I just had to go with it.
Well, it is beautiful and it's a wonderful sentiment and I absolutely agree with it. My point was just going to be that to what it is that you were saying about government, what frustrates me when people talk about the government as though it is some external entity separate from the individuals making it up. Every single one of us knows somebody who works for the government in some fashion or other. And yet we apply these notions, we apply these actions, we apply these motives to the government as though the government isn't made up of innumerable individuals. Not innumerable. We could certainly tally up how many government employees there are at a given point, but you get what I'm driving at. We depersonalize the government so that we can otherize it and we can turn it into an enemy or a foe. Let's not do that. Let's think about everyone we know who works for the government, whether it's somebody who works, for a county agency, whether it's somebody who works as a congressional aide or legislative aide. Your cops are government employees. Your firefighters are government employees. If you really want to break it down like that, your local elected officials are the government. We all know the government, and it is us. So I just want to disabuse anybody of that notion that if you're ranting and raving and raging against the government, you are ranting and raving and raging against your neighbors, your friends, your family. It's a separate notion from some of the topics that we're discussing earlier, but it bothers me to my core as a student of government, as a former elected official, and as a government employee for over a decade. This notion that, we're in New Jersey, so people talk about Trenton, or they talk about Washington, D.C., that the government, as though it's some singular entity acting without regard for anyone else, and that it's completely unbeholden to anybody.
And we've come full circle, because when you actually treat it that way, it makes all the sense in the world to think that you're going to need someone or something that is powerful enough to stand up to that when you dehumanize it. And it allows for you to put on a pedestal that someone or something to accomplish that goal, which is exactly why we bring it all the way to the original point. Not in the way that we expected, but it means that we allow ourselves to believe that there is going to be that hero that fixes it all. We do it every election cycle. We do it every time someone says the right firebrand format to get everyone riled up. It's a lovely sentiment. It's a great thing to have ideals and think that there is a person that embodies all of it, and to have in our world a superhero that does it. And I'm sorry, I'm just saying, there are amazing human beings in the world, but there is no one person that is that. And I don't ever want to give that impression, even with what I'm saying. I think everyone is amazing. I don't think one person is ever going to be that superhero, even if that's the thing that we're looking for to save us.
Amen to that. So, we could continue to go on and on, but I think that's as good a place as any to stop this episode. So, recommended reading, I would say those stories that Matt mentioned, Must There Be a Superman? Mark Waid's run on The Flash, Ultimate Spider-Man Annual 2, Watchmen, Superman Red Sun, and then read about the history of seatbelts, read about moral hazard, read about the Kitty Genovese case and bystander effect, and read about how these things are a part of your life and you don't recognize it, and then learn how to critically think and analyze these aspects of your life so that you're at least mindful of them. Because the key is not to eliminate them or say, no, I'm never going to think like this again. You're not being realistic. But if you can say, hey, I'm currently wrapped up in this mentality, or, hey, that's a situation where I see XYZ happening, that's where the magic happens. It's critical thinking. So being able to spot these things and increasing your self-awareness for these types of situations, that's where the change happens. So upcoming episodes, Wanda Maximoff, Beast Boy, and Sue Storm. We're also going to have at some point in there, we will be recording with our Mental Health Avengers. We're going to be doing that very, very soon. It's happening early May. So that episode will drop at some point in the month of May. Not really sure when. I'm also not going to broadcast too much more beyond Sue Storm because, as we've already indicated, late May is when my wife is due to give birth. So we're going to be taking a short hiatus while I cope with having 2 children in the house. And make her help me. I'm going to need all the assistance I can get. So you can find all of our episodes on our website, capesonthecouch.com, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Capes on the Couch. Our Patreon, if you want to be a patron like Matt or like many of the others. Nicole is one of our recent patrons. You can go to patreon.com/capesonthecouch and subscribe, unlock additional material, uncensored stuff, early access, etc. And I think we've rambled on long enough. I would just like to say again, thank you, Matt, for a wonderful topic that I've been looking forward to for a long time, and appreciate the opportunity, as you always give us, to have these discussions, these debates. They're not usually quite this emphatic, but every once in a while we got to do something a little different. So, Doc, the floor is yours.
Well, I'm not that strong and Anthony's not that fast, but damn it, we're both fresh from the fight.
For Doc Issues, I'm Anthony Sitko. Thanks for listening. See you next week.
Capes on the Couch podcast is for entertainment purposes only. Dr. Issues is a psychiatrist, but he is not your psychiatrist and does not have knowledge of your individual situation. For any personal mental health concerns, please consult your own healthcare providers. For medical emergencies, please call 911 or the designated number in your area immediately. Remember that you are not alone and help is out there.